13 hours. 3 airports, 2 weather delays, and a final stretch on a rattling shuttle bus that wound through pine forests so thick they seemed to close in around us. By the time the driver dropped me near the gravel road leading to the cabins, my legs ached and my hands felt stiff around the handle of my suitcase. Still, I carried on, because I had a gift meant to delight my son, a ribbon-tied bottle of Pemberton's Reserve, a bourbon he once called liquid gold. The plan had been simple. Mark hadn't expected me at his annual guys' retreat, but I imagined his face lighting up when he opened the door and saw me there holding the bottle he loved. I told myself this trip was for both of us proof that even at 67 I could still make the long journey, still show up, still be the mother who tried. Cabin 12 stood at the end of the row weather-worn cedar boards, silvered by age light, leaking through the curtains in warm squares. I straightened my scarf and steadied my breath before stepping onto the porch. My hand had just brushed the brass knob when his voice carried through the thin wood. If she vanished, Mark said casual, as if remarking on the weather that insurance money would clear my debts. The words cracked through me, sharp and merciless. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard the long travel hours playing tricks. But then a low laugh answered him, one of his friends, and Lyra would never suspect a thing. I froze. Lyra, my daughter. Or did he mean someone else's sister? The ambiguity cut deeper than certainty, leaving me reeling. My heart thudded painfully as I pressed my palm to the door, too afraid to move, too horrified to stay. Inside, chairs scraped and glasses clinked. Another man chuckled, the sound muffled by distance. My Mark. My little boy, who once begged me to read Treasure Island for the 100th time, was plotting in a voice I barely recognized. I looked down at the bourbon. The ribbon I'd tied in my kitchen that morning seemed absurd, now a flourish for a celebration that would never happen. My hands trembled so badly I feared I'd drop it. Slowly, I bent and placed the bottle against the wall by the door. The gift no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the silence. The cold night air rushed into my lungs, sharp and bracing. I backed down the porch steps, gravel crunching beneath my shoes. With every step I put between myself and that cabin, the weight inside my chest grew heavier. I wanted to run, to scream, to storm in, and demand an explanation, but I knew the moment for confrontation had passed. At the tree line, I glanced back once. Through the window, I caught a sliver of Mark's face, lit by lamplight, animated as he gestured with a playing card in hand. He looked relaxed, even jovial, as though nothing dark had been spoken. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it all, but the words replayed cruel and undeniable. If she vanished, Lyra would never suspect. I turned away, tightening my scarf against the wind, and kept walking until the glow of the cabins dimmed behind me. My suitcase wheels rattled unevenly over the gravel, my body moving on instinct, alone. The shuttle stop was nearly 2 miles back, but I welcomed the distance. Each step was a shield, each breath a thin act of survival. By the time I reached the empty roadside, the sky had darkened to a blue-black canopy pricked with stars. I pulled my coat tighter and lowered myself onto a bench worn smooth by weather. Somewhere in the distance, laughter spilled from the cabins, echoing like ghosts across the water. I stared down the dark road, waiting for the next shuttle. My mind circling the words I could never unhear. The bourbon sat abandoned on the porch behind me, a ribboned relic of trust I could never reclaim. And as I sat there shivering under the foreign sky, one thought anchored itself so deeply I could hardly breathe. Nothing between us would ever be the same again. Back in Kansas City, The rhythm of ordinary days tried to claim me again. The tulips in my garden pushed through the soil stubborn against the early spring chill, and I crouched among them with shears in hand, pretending I could prune my thoughts as easily as I trimmed dead leaves. Yet every snip, every faint perfume of earth only returned me to that porch, to the sound of Mark's voice through weathered wood. I did not tell the neighbors at morning coffee group. I did not tell the women at choir practice when they asked about my trip. Instead, I smiled, said travel was tiring at my age, and tucked away the tremor in my voice. Shame threaded itself into my silence, shame that my own son could speak of me as a liability, as a check to be cashed. And fear, too. Fear that if I spoke the words aloud, they would harden into something undeniable. At night, I found myself moving through the house, quietly, double-checking locks I had never bothered with, before glancing at shadows stretched long across the living room. The bourbon I had meant to gift him haunted me. I saw the bottle in memory as though it still sat on the porch, waiting for hands that didn't deserve it. 2 weeks blurred into one long ache. I buried myself in tasks, writing lists, baking pies for church socials, sorting old papers in my study. The banality of routine was a cover, but it could not muffle the echo. If she vanished, Lyra would never suspect a thing. On a damp Tuesday evening, as I pulled weeds by the fence, my phone buzzed in the pocket of my apron. The screen lit with Lyra's name. My daughter rarely called during the week. Her voice usually came through in cheerful Saturday updates about her clinic or new recipes she was trying. I answered quickly, wiping soil from my hands. Her voice was unsteady, thick with tears. "Mom, I don't know what to do." My chest tightened. "What's wrong?" "There've been men hanging around Mark's place. Not friends, not anyone I know. They look rough, like they're waiting for him. One of them cornered me outside the grocery store, asking if I'd seen my brother. And Mom, Mark's been asking about your will. Not just once. Over and over." I steadied myself against the fence post, the wood damp beneath my palm. The garden seemed to fade, leaving only the sharp crack of his words that night, the laughter that had followed. My daughter's sobs reached across the line, pulling me back. "Did they hurt you?" I asked. "No, but they knew my name. They knew where I lived." She drew in a shuddering breath. "I'm scared, Mom. I don't know what's happening, but it's not just gambling anymore. It feels dangerous." The truth hovered on my tongue, pressing to be freed. I wanted to tell her everything about the porch, the bourbon, the whispered plot, but the weight of it rooted me to silence. To speak it would mean shattering her last illusions about her brother, about family itself. "I'll handle it," I said softly, though my throat felt raw. "You're not alone, Lyra. We'll figure this out." She sniffled, calmer for the promise, though we both knew it was thin. After we hung up, I stood in the damp earth, with the phone still pressed to my chest, the evening air cooling around me. The tulips bobbed gently in the breeze as if nodding in grim agreement. The weight of silence pressed heavier than ever. I had carried it alone for 2 weeks, but now it threatened to crack under its own gravity. Still, I could not release it, not yet. Instead, I gathered it closer, like an old coat against the chill, and walked back into the house where shadows lengthened across the walls. When I set the phone down on the kitchen counter, I already knew I would have to start writing things down piece by piece before the silence swallowed me whole. The morning after Lyra's call, I carried a leather-bound ledger from my study shelf to the kitchen table. Its spine was cracked from decades of use once my companion in the archives where I worked, filled with neat entries about manuscripts and fragile letters. I had always believed in the power of careful record-keeping, the way small details could form a larger truth. Now that same instinct rose in me again, but this time the subject wasn't history. It was my son. I uncapped my pen, smoothed a blank page, and wrote at the top in slow strokes, "Observations mark." The words looked clinical, almost detached, but my pulse thudded as if I'd committed a betrayal. Yet the greater betrayal had already been spoken on that cabin porch. Line by line, I began to write what I had buried in memory. Last autumn, Mark arriving with a contract for me to sign something about streamlining insurance paperwork. The signature line bore my name in a scrawl that looked oddly familiar, yet not my own. I had laughed it off, telling him to shred it, but the unease had lingered. I wrote October. Forged-looking signature attempted beneficiary change. Another entry surfaced as clearly as if it were yesterday, a hiking trip 2 summers ago, when Mark insisted I stand closer to the cliff's edge for a photo. The ground crumbled beneath my heel, and only my quick grab at a root kept me from falling. He'd laughed, nervous, said, "You're tougher than you look, Mom." I'd accepted it as clumsy enthusiasm. Now, under the ink of my ledger, it read, "July," near accident encouragement toward danger. My pen scratched across the page, each detail stitching together into something far darker than I'd allowed myself to see. His constant questions about my life insurance policy disguised as curiosity about planning for the future. His complaints about debt always followed by hints that your security gives me peace of mind. His sudden interest in the layout of my house, particularly the locks and exits. The catalog grew page after page until my neat handwriting blurred with the pressure of my grip. Each memory carried a sharp edge, now slicing away the comfort of maternal excuses. I paused, staring at the ink glistening under the light. A part of me recoiled at what I was doing, committing my own son to the permanence of paper, as though I were both witness and judge. Yet another part of me felt steadier for it. In archives, truth survived because someone had bothered to write it down. I flipped to a fresh page and drew 2 columns. Warnings ignored and reasons given. Under the first, I listed the accidents, the forged papers, the overheard whispers. Under the second, I forced myself to admit the lies I'd told myself. He's under stress. He doesn't mean it. All sons test their mothers. Seeing them side by side stripped the comfort away. The phone rang while I was bent over the ledger, but I let it go to voicemail. I couldn't bear the thought of Mark's voice, not yet, maybe not ever. Instead, I kept writing until my hand cramped, and the ledger lay heavy with ink and accusation. When I finally set the pen down, the kitchen felt changed, as though the air itself carried the weight of my pages. I pressed my palm to the cover, sealing the words inside. This was no longer just a record. It was evidence, and it was mine. Through the window, I saw my tulips nodding in the wind, their bright heads defiant against the gray sky. My heart ached with the knowledge that beauty and danger had been growing side by side in my life, and I had chosen not to notice. The ledger lay open before me, its pages ready for what would come next, and I knew there would be more. The day after finishing my ledger, I called Ruth Alder. Her voice had the same gravelly steadiness it carried when we first met 40 years ago, back when she helped me and my late husband draft our first wills. She didn't ask why I wanted an urgent appointment. She simply said, "Come by this afternoon. Bring whatever you need me to see." I carried the ledger under one arm as I climbed the wide steps to her office. The brass plaque on the door read, "Alder and Finch, attorneys at law, though Finch had retired years back." Ruth's office still smelled faintly of lemon polish and pipe smoke. She rose from her chair when I entered. Shorter than I remembered her frame, thinned by age, but her eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. We sat across from one another at her oak desk. She adjusted her scarf, studying me before I even spoke. "You're pale, Eleanor. Something's wrong." I slid the ledger toward her. She opened it, flipping through the pages I had filled with my neat script. I watched her expression shift the lawyer's mask, faltering into something closer to grief. When she reached the entry marked cabin, overheard words, she looked up at me. "Do you believe he would truly harm you?" The room seemed to shrink. I heard my own voice, smaller than I intended, whisper back, "I no longer know." She closed the ledger with care, as if it were a sacred text. Then we plan as if the worst is possible. We build walls he cannot scale. For the next 2 hours, she guided me through decisions that felt like chiseling away pieces of my life. We updated my will, shifting primary assets into a trust that only Lyra could access, ensuring that no sudden change of beneficiary could be forged in my absence. We arranged for my house deed to be secured with a stipulation that it could not be leveraged for loans without dual authorization. Ruth pushed a form across the desk, an affidavit notarized and stamped with the state seal. "You need to write down exactly what you overheard at that cabin, word for word." My hand trembled as I signed, committing the horror to paper once again. As the notary pressed her stamp, a sense of finality settled over me. The affidavit felt heavier than its few pages, as though I had locked away not only assets, but also my last illusions about my son. When the paperwork was done, Ruth leaned back in her chair. Her voice softened. "Eleanor, I've known you through every stage of your life: marriage, children, widowhood. I've seen your kindness hold a family together, but kindness cannot protect you here." Tears blurred my sight, hot and unwanted. I pressed a tissue to my face, ashamed of my shaking. "I keep searching for the boy I raised, the one who built forts in the backyard and brought me dandelions. I want to believe he's still there." Ruth reached across the desk and squeezed my hand. "You can love the memory, but you must protect the woman you are now." That evening, I drove straight to the bank. The clerk recognized me from years of mundane deposits, but today I asked for a private lockbox. Into it, I placed copies of the trust, the affidavit, and a duplicate of the ledger. The box clicked shut with metallic certainty, as if sealing a vault around both my fears and my resolve. When I returned home, I paused in the doorway of my quiet kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the old floorboards. Ordinary sounds, but my world had already shifted. My life was now lines on paper, signatures under seals files locked behind steel. I washed my hands, dried them carefully, and set a fresh page in the ledger. What came next, I would record too. The week after sealing the documents in the bank's lockbox, I found myself driving north again, back toward the place where everything had cracked. I told myself it was for the fresh air, for the sight of migrating birds along the lake. It wasn't a lie. I carried binoculars slung around my neck and a worn field guide in my bag, but they were props, just as the bourbon bottle had once been. The road narrowed as the forest closed in tall pines shivering against a gray sky. My hands tightened on the wheel when the lake came into view, its surface rippling under a restless wind. I parked near a public trailhead and walked slowly along the path, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. The scent of damp leaves rose around me, mingling with the faint smoke of distant fireplaces. I lifted my binoculars now and then, pretending to scan the branches, but my gaze drifted back to the row of cabins across the water. Cabin 12 stood quiet in the daylight blinds drawn its porch empty. From this distance, It looked harmless, an aging vacation retreat like any other. Only I knew the venom that had seeped into its walls. A voice behind me made me start. "Haven't seen you out here in years." I turned to find a man in a deputy's jacket, broad-shouldered but weathered around the eyes. He removed his cap politely. "Callan Miles. I knew your husband. He used to fish this lake every spring." The name tugged at my memory, one of the younger deputies back then, often waving from his patrol car when Harold and I brought the children up for holidays. His hair was peppered with gray now, but his manner was steady, almost kind. "I remember you," I said. Harold always spoke well of the local deputies. He smiled faintly. "Your husband had a way of making friends. You don't see many folks from Kansas City come back after they sell their cabins." I hesitated, adjusting the strap of my binoculars. I've been thinking of taking up birdwatching more seriously. The lake's still beautiful. He studied me, his gaze curious, but not intrusive. "It is, though some of the newer renters aren't as considerate as the old families. We've had noise complaints, a few late-night parties. Cabin 12 in particular's been rowdy." The words slid into the air like a cue, and I forced my tone to stay casual. "That's the one my son uses now. I wondered if you'd had any issues." Callan raised an eyebrow. "Your boy's place?" "We've had reports of card games going late into the night, a few neighbors unsettled by the company he keeps. Nothing illegal I can pin down, but enough to keep us circling." My heart beat faster, but I kept my voice even. I suppose young men like to feel wild. "Still, it worries me when strangers wander in. Has anyone ever filed more serious concerns?" He tilted his head as if weighing my words. "Not officially, but if you've got reason to think there's trouble, you can always call me direct." He pulled a card from his pocket and handed it over. His handwriting on the back was neat, sell day or night. I slipped it into my coat. "Thank you. I hope it won't come to that." We stood for a moment, the lake wind fluttering between us. Callan adjusted his cap again. "Your husband once told me the lake teaches patience. I'd say the same about life. Just be careful, Mrs. Vera." I nodded, the ache of Harold's absence sharp in my chest. Careful is all I can be these days. He tipped his head in farewell and continued down the path. I watched him go, then turned back to the water. The cabins lay silent, but his words lingered. Noise complaints, strangers, neighbors unsettled, seeds of awareness just as I intended. I lowered the binoculars and walked back toward the car, the card burning like a match in my pocket. Lyra came over the following Sunday afternoon, her shoulders hunched against the March wind. She carried a bag of groceries in one hand, the kind of practical gesture she had always made, as if tending to me kept her own fears at bay. We cooked together in the kitchen, chopping carrots for stew, the silence between us heavier than the simmering pot. When she finally set the knife down, she leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Her face was pale, her voice low. "Mom, I need to tell you something about Mark." The way she said his name made me brace myself. "Go on." "He came to me last week desperate. He wanted me to co-sign a loan using your house as collateral. He said it was just a short-term thing, a bridge until a deal closed. But when I pressed, he admitted the truth. He's in deep with a poker circle, owes around $200,000. The number struck like a stone against glass. I had suspected gambling, but the scale of it hollowed me out. I stirred the stew to keep my hands from trembling. "Did you sign?" Her eyes flashed with hurt. "Of course not. But he begged Mom. He said the men he owes aren't patient. He even mentioned your life insurance as if..." Her voice broke. As if he'd thought about it as a solution. I closed my eyes, steadying my breath. To hear the echo of what I'd overheard on that porch come from my daughter's lips, it felt like confirmation carved in stone. When I opened them again, Lyra was watching me, waiting for an answer I wasn't sure I had. "Did he threaten you?" I asked. "No. But the way he looked at me, I think he would have taken my signature if he could have. He's not himself anymore." She rubbed her arms as though chilled. "I don't even recognize my brother." I set the spoon down, wiped my hands on a towel, and faced her squarely. "Listen to me, Lyra. No bailouts. Not from you, not from me. We've done that too many times. What he needs now isn't saving, it's a boundary." Her chin trembled. "But if we don't help, he could get hurt. Or worse." I reached for her hand, folding it into mine. "And if we keep helping, he'll never stop. Boundaries are the only mercy left. Love without them turns into fuel for destruction." Tears filled her eyes, but she nodded. "You're right. I don't want to lose him." Neither did I. But loss had already begun the night on the porch when his words sliced through any illusion of safety. I could not say that aloud, not yet. Instead, I squeezed her hand tighter as though sheer pressure might hold us both together. We ate the stew in near silence, both of us chewing more on fear than on food. Lyra washed the dishes afterward, her movements brisk as if scrubbing away the conversation. Before leaving, she paused in the doorway. "You've always been stronger than me about him, Mom. Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," I said, though the word tasted fragile. After she left, I sat at the table with the ledger open before me. I added a new entry march. Lyra reports Mark requested loan using house as collateral. Debts, $200K. Reference to life insurance repeated. The ink dried dark and final. I closed the ledger and rested both hands on its cover. My daughter's fear had become mine, doubled, yet beneath it, a new resolve took root. If I could not save Mark, perhaps I could save Lyra, and maybe myself along with her. The wind rattled the windows, a restless sound that matched the turmoil inside me. I rose to lock the doors and pulled the curtains tight. Tomorrow, I would call Ruth again. The following Wednesday, I received a call from Nora Quince, the bank investigator Ruth had connected me with. Her voice was professional, clipped the kind that made you sit straighter without being told. "Mrs. Vera, I'd like you to come in. There are some irregularities you need to see in person." I drove downtown under a sky the color of tarnished silver, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles whitened. The lobby smelled faintly of polish and ink the way banks always had, but this time the air felt hostile. Nora met me near the reception desk, a slim woman with dark hair pulled into a bun and a gaze that missed nothing. She ushered me into a small conference room and spread a neat stack of documents across the table. "Let's begin with these." She slid the first form toward me. At the top, my name was printed in bold, followed by an address that was mine, and yet not an apartment across town I had never lived in. The form was an application for a credit line. This was submitted online last month, she explained. When our system flagged inconsistencies, the applicant followed up in person with identification under your name. The ID was convincing, but the signature raised suspicion. My throat tightened as I leaned closer. The signature looked eerily like mine, the same loops and flourishes, but the slope of the letters was wrong, hurried, where mine was patient. I felt as though I were staring at a ghost of myself, a mimic wearing my skin. She laid another form on top. This one was for a savings account. Same applicant, same forged ID. And here she tapped the next page with her pen. A request for beneficiary change on a life insurance policy. The handwriting is close, but we confirmed it isn't yours. The words swam before me. A cold film spread across my skin as if I'd stepped into a draft. So someone tried to change who would inherit, yes. The request named your son, Mark Vera, as sole beneficiary. The sound of my own breath filled the room too loud, too uneven. The ledger entries I had written came rushing back. Forged signature casual questions about insurance, whispered talk of debts. I hadn't been paranoid. I had been right. Nora's expression softened slightly, though her tone stayed measured. Mrs. Vera, I know this is difficult, but we need to move carefully. If the attempts continue, we can pursue charges. For now, everything is documented, and your accounts have been flagged for additional verification. No changes will go through without your physical presence. I nodded, my hands clenched in my lap. My own name had become a weapon sharpened by my son's desperation. Nora slid a final paper toward me. I'll need you to sign here, acknowledging that these attempts were fraudulent. It strengthens our case. My pen hovered before the line. For the first time in days, I felt the weight of my signature not as routine, but as defense. Each curve of my letters was a refusal, a reclaiming of ground stolen from me. When I set the pen down, my name gleamed in ink, authentic and undeniable. Nora gathered the forms. We'll stay in close contact. If anything else surfaces, I'll call you immediately. When I stepped back into the lobby, the fluorescent light seemed harsher, the marble floor colder. I walked through the revolving door into the chill of the afternoon, clutching my coat tighter. The city bustled around me, but all I could hear was the echo of my son's voice and the scratch of a forged signature pretending to be mine. That evening, I added another entry to the ledger fraudulent accounts attempted. Beneficiary change forged. Mark named sole heir. The ink bled slightly where my hand shook, but the words stood firm. I closed the book and rested my hand on its cover, feeling the throb of my pulse beneath my skin. My name had been stolen, twisted into a weapon, but I would not let it remain in his hands. The next step would be mine. I invited Mark to dinner the following Friday. My tone over the phone had been warm, almost casual, as though nothing heavy hung between us. He agreed too quickly, his voice forced light, and I knew he heard more in my invitation than I said. The table was set for 2 simple but deliberate roast chicken potatoes, green beans, a bottle of wine I had opened earlier to breathe. Candles flickered low, softening the edges of the evening. I wanted him calm, disarmed. In the center of the table, gleaming under the candlelight, lay a single brass key. It wasn't to my house, though he would assume so. It belonged to the guest cottage behind the garden, a place he had once begged to use during college summers. I polished it until it shone and set it carefully on a folded napkin, where it could not be missed. He arrived late, smelling faintly of cologne and fatigue, his smile stretched thin. "Mom? This looks amazing," he said, kissing the air near my cheek. His eyes landed on the key almost immediately. We ate in a haze of small talk. He asked about my garden, complimented the meal, laughed at the right places. I listened, nodding, though my mind traced every twitch of his gaze toward the center of the table. The key glimmered like bait, and he was circling it. Halfway through the meal, as he reached for another slice of chicken, his fingers grazed the brass. "Is this?" He held it up between us, grin widening. "You finally trust me with the house key?" I kept my fork steady, though my pulse jumped. "That key doesn't open this house." His smile faltered, then returned too quick. "Oh, then what's it for the cottage?" I sipped my wine, watching him over the rim. "I thought of letting you stay there if you needed space." But keys, Mark, come with conditions. He twirled it between his fingers, feigning lightness. Conditions. Respect knocks, I said evenly, reaching out and sliding the key back across the table to my side. It does not pocket. For a moment, silence pressed in heavy as stone. His jaw worked as though he wanted to argue, to laugh it off, to turn the scene into one of his old charms. But the veneer cracked. The grin slipped away, leaving something harder underneath. "You don't trust me," he said. Finally, voice low. I set my fork down. "You've given me reasons not to." His eyes narrowed, but he leaned back, masking the tension with a shrug. "You're being dramatic. It's just a key." "No," I answered softly. "It's everything a key represents." The candles sputtered slightly as the furnace kicked on shadows flickering across his face. He looked older in that light worn by debts and choices I couldn't mend. For years I had tried to cushion his falls to keep him from bruising. Now I saw the bruises clearly self-inflicted and spreading. He pushed his plate away, appetite gone. "If you don't want me here, just say so." "I do want you here," I said, my hand covering the key. "But only if you understand the door stays locked until you learn how to knock." His gaze lingered on me, sharp and searching, before he rose abruptly from the table. "I've got things to do," he muttered, avoiding my eyes. I watched him go, the slam of the front door echoing through the house like a warning shot. When the sound faded, I exhaled and slid the key back into my pocket, cool and solid against my palm. Later, after clearing the dishes alone, I returned to the ledger. On a fresh page, I wrote "Dinner with Mark." Test of key. Attempted to pocket without asking. Confrontation, resentment visible. The ink dried, as steady as my hand. I closed the book and placed the key on top a marker for what could no longer be ignored. The morning after Mark stormed out, I phoned Ruth. My voice was steady, but beneath it ran a current of resolve I had not felt before. "It's time we build something stronger than locks and promises," I told her. She welcomed me into her office with the same calm she always carried, but I noticed she'd already cleared her desk for work. Stacks of folders waited, color-coded, precise. "If we're doing this, Eleanor, we're doing it right," she said. We began with the affidavit I had filed earlier, expanding it into a comprehensive record. I wrote a full account of the night at the cabin, his exact words, the laughter that followed the bourbon abandoned on the porch. Ruth had it notarized again, each stamp pressing authority into the page. Next came the ledger. I read aloud the entries I had made one by one, while Ruth dictated them into a recorder. The near fall on the cliff, the forged-looking signature, Lyra's report of the loan request, each piece was preserved twice now, once in ink, once in sound. My own voice, tired but unbroken, filled the room as testimony. Ruth tapped her pen against the desk. "We need digital evidence too. Anything he sent in writing." I opened my phone and scrolled through messages. Mark's casual notes about policy updates, his impatient reminders about signing forms. Alone, they seemed benign, but under Ruth's eye, paired with dates and ledger entries, they became something else, a pattern. She took screenshots, printed them, slid them into plastic sleeves. By late afternoon, a thick binder sat between us, its weight startling. Inside were pages notarized and signed copies of texts, photographs of the forged documents Nora had flagged, even a statement from Lyra confirming Mark's request for her signature. On the spine, Ruth labeled it simply, "Protection Dossier." I ran my hand over the cover, its smooth plastic cool under my fingertips. "Paper tigers," I murmured. Ruth glanced up. "What do you mean? All these sheets, all this ink. They look fierce enough, but they're only dangerous if someone believes them." Otherwise, they're just paper." Her mouth softened into a faint smile. "Then let's make sure the right people believe them." That night, I prepared 2 additional copies. One stayed with Ruth, locked in her office, safe. The second I sealed in a heavy envelope addressed in careful block letters to Deputy Callan Miles. I included a note folded inside open if anything happens to me. At the post office, I stood in line behind a young mother juggling her toddler, the ordinariness of her errands brushing against the enormity of mine. When it was my turn, I slid the envelope across the counter and watched as the clerk weighed it, stamped it, and tossed it into a bin already filled with other people's lives. Walking back to my car, I felt a strange mix of weakness and strength. I was arming myself with pages, trusting that in a world of shadows and whispers, paper could become a blade. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the final copy spread before me. I flipped through the pages, slowly hearing the echoes of each moment as if they were alive again. My son's laughter behind a cabin door, my daughter's tearful confession, my own hand signing where his had tried to forge. I closed the binder with a snap and slid it beneath the ledger. 2 guardians now rested side by side, the quiet record of a mother and the formal dossier of a witness. The house settled into silence around me, but I knew better than to trust its calm. Somewhere Mark was circling debts, pressing closer, and I was ready for the next knock. I told Mark it was just a birthday tea, a small gathering to mark my 68th year without fuss. He seemed relieved when I added that I'd invited a couple of his friends along with Lyra. Perhaps he thought it meant I was softening, folding him back into my trust. The truth was different. 2 cameras were already hidden in plain sight, one tucked inside the hutch, facing the dining table, another set on the mantel in the parlor. Lyra didn't know. I wanted her reactions to be unvarnished. On Saturday afternoon, sunlight slanted across the table I had laid with china cups, lemon slices, and a cake iced with pale buttercream. It looked harmless, domestic, even festive. But beneath the lace runner lay my intention to capture what politeness could not conceal. Lyra arrived first, carrying a bouquet of lilies. She hugged me tightly, her eyes searching mine for reassurance. I whispered, "Stay sharp," before letting her go. She nodded, tension tightening her jaw. Mark came soon after, flanked by 2 men I had never met, but recognized instantly, by type one too slick in his suit, the other rough around the edges, a grin that never reached his eyes. They brought no gifts, only loud greetings and the faint scent of stale tobacco. We settled around the table. I poured tea, steadying my hand, though my pulse raced. Conversation fluttered at first. Weather sports, half-hearted compliments about the cake. Mark played host, laughing too easily, his eyes flicking between me and his companions. Then one of the men leaned back in his chair, stirring sugar into his cup with exaggerated slowness. "Beautiful lake out here," he said. "Lots of accidents waiting to happen. Canoes tip so easy." The words dropped like stones into the room. Mark's smile froze, then flickered back brittle. Lyra's spoon clattered against her saucer. I felt the weight of the cameras catching every twitch, every shadow. The second man chuckled, nudging Mark. "You remember that story you told us about the insurance policies? That was rich." Lyra's face drained of color. She turned to me, eyes wide-mouthed, parting as if to speak. I reached under the table and touched her hand, stilling her. My voice, when it came, was even. "Gentlemen, let's keep the conversation fitting for tea." They laughed, brushing it off as though it were nothing but the damage was done. The mask had slipped. The recording would show more than words. It would show Lyra's horror, my restraint, and Mark's silence in the wake of it. The rest of the gathering dragged like lead. I asked about work, about families. The men offered vague answers, quick deflections. They grew restless once the cake was cut, as if eager to leave behind the veneer of civility. Mark avoided my eyes. His jaw tight, his teacup untouched. When they finally rose to go, Lyra followed me into the kitchen. Her voice shook. "Mom, it's real. He's really in danger, and so are we." I wiped my hands on a towel, meeting her gaze. "Yes. Now you see." Her eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "What are we going to do?" "We already have," I said, quietly thinking of the cameras humming in silence. When the last car pulled from the driveway, I returned to the parlor and retrieved the small device from the mantel. Its red light blinked once before shutting off. The faces, the laughter, the careless words, they were all mine, now sealed into memory. No one could deny. That night, I added another entry to the ledger: birthday tea. 2 associates present. Mention of canoe accidents insurance. Lyra witnessed confirmed danger. I set the pen down and closed the book, my hand lingering on the cover. The line between family and evidence had vanished. What remained was survival. It happened just past midnight, the hour when silence should have been thickest. I had been reading in bed, the ledger balanced across my lap, when the faintest hiss reached my ears. At first, I thought it was wind sneaking through the window frame, but when I went downstairs, the scent struck me sharp, metallic, unmistakable. Gas. I froze at the kitchen door. The burner knob on the stove was twisted just shy of ignition. The room hummed with danger. My hand shook as I grabbed a dish towel and turned the valve closed, then flung open the windows. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Minutes later, the smoke alarm shrieked not from fire, but from the match I'd instinctively struck to test the air before realizing how close I'd come. I dropped it, stamping it out before it could spark further disaster. The smell of sulfur mingled with gas, my stomach turning sour. I called Caleb, my neighbor 2 doors down, a retired firefighter who had always been the first to arrive when storms knocked out power or branches fell across the road. He showed up in minutes, a heavy coat thrown over his pajamas, flashlight in hand. "Good Lord, Eleanor," he muttered as he examined the stove. He crouched low, tracing the line with practiced fingers, then pointed to the knob. "This isn't wear and tear. Someone loosened it. Deliberate." I steadied myself against the counter. "You're certain?" He looked up, beam of his flashlight catching the hard lines of his face. "I'd stake my pension on it. You didn't leave this like that. Somebody wanted gas pooling in here." The weight of his words settled over me like wet wool. Caleb stood, turned off the main valve, and walked through every room with me, checking windows and locks. Nothing else looked disturbed, yet the intent clung to the air like smoke. He rested a hand on my shoulder before leaving. "You shouldn't sleep in here tonight, at least not until someone checks the lines thoroughly. Come stay with my wife and me." I thanked him but shook my head. "I'll be all right. I have another place on the property." He frowned but didn't argue. "Then lock everything and call me if anything so much as creaks wrong." "Promise, I promise." After he left, I gathered what I needed: a stack of files, the ledger, the binder Ruth had prepared, and a small overnight bag. My hands trembled as I tucked the cameras under my arm, the same ones that had captured laughter turning sinister at my birthday tea. The night was sharp with cold as I crossed the yard. The guest cottage stood quiet, its porch light flickering with moths. I had not slept there in years, but tonight, its separation from the main house felt like safety. Inside, The air smelled of cedar and dust, untouched yet welcoming. I set up the cameras again, one aimed at the door, the other at the window, and tested the feeds on my laptop. Their tiny red lights glowed back at me like patient eyes. Only then did I let myself sink into the narrow bed exhaustion, finally breaking through adrenaline. Sleep did not come easily. Every creak of the walls, every scrape of branches outside made me jolt upright. I kept the ledger on the nightstand, my hand brushing its cover like a talisman. The gas smell clung to my hair, phantom and persistent, as though reminding me what had nearly been. When dawn finally thinned the darkness, I rose and looked back at the main house. Its windows reflected pale light, innocent as always. But I knew innocence was gone. Someone had tried to turn my home into a tomb, and so I would not sleep under its roof again, not until the truth was dragged into daylight. The knock came just after lunch, not frantic, not heavy 3 measured raps as if the visitor had every right to be expected. I opened the cottage door to find a man in a dark suit, polished shoes planted firmly on the step. His tie was neat, his smile practiced. Mrs. Vera, his voice was warm but carried an undercurrent like gravel beneath silk. Yes, he inclined his head. Victor Doss, I represent a circle your son frequents. I won't take much of your time. I stepped aside just enough to signal courtesy without granting welcome. He remained on the threshold, his posture precise. Mark owes $240,000, he said. Deadline's approaching. My employers aren't fond of delays. The number landed like a hammer, though my face betrayed nothing. I clasped my hands lightly in front of me. I see. And you thought it wise to come to his mother, not wise necessary. He smiled again, then efficient. He tells us assets exist. Houses. Policies. We don't care where the funds come from, only that they arrive. Behind me, the quiet hum of the hidden camera recorded every syllable. I let silence stretch before I answered, studying his polished cufflinks, the way his eyes flicked once to the side window, as if noting every possible angle of entry. Mr. Doss, I said at last what you describe is between you and my son. I do not cover his debts. I do, however, expect the law to intervene should threats cross my doorstep. His smile didn't falter, though his eyes chilled. We prefer civility, but you know how uncivil accidents can be. A canoe tips a fire sparks. Tragedy doesn't ask permission. My heartbeat quickened, but I kept my voice steady. Then perhaps you should speak with someone who specializes in preventing fraud. I reached into the drawer of the entry table, withdrew a plain business card, and held it out to him. Nora Quince, investigator. She already monitors my accounts. You're welcome to explain your concerns to her. He accepted the card with a faint arch of his brow, studying it as though it were a puzzle. Then, with an elegant nod, he tucked it into his breast pocket. You're a composed woman, Mrs. Vera. I admire that. Composure can be rare when debts draw blood. Composure, I said quietly, is what keeps me alive. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he tapped the brim of his hat, an old-fashioned gesture almost courteous. We'll be in touch. Tell your son his clock runs thin. He turned, walking back to a silver sedan parked neatly along the lane. I watched until it disappeared around the bend, only then closing the door and exhaling the breath I'd caged. I retrieved the camera from its place near the window and played back the recording. His measured voice filled the cottage again. The debt, the deadline, the threats dressed as parables. Evidence now. Not just stories from a mother's lips, but the face of a man whose civility masked menace. I set the device beside the ledger and opened to a fresh page. Victor Doss, collector. Debt confirmed $240,000. Threats veiled in accidents. Deadline near. The ink dried beneath my hand as my resolve hardened. Mark's choices had drawn predators to my very door. But the predators had underestimated me. And soon, so would my son. The message arrived just after dusk, my phone buzzing against the kitchen counter while I rinsed dishes. Mark's name glowed on the screen. I hesitated, dread crawling cold through my chest before opening it. It was a screenshot, an insurance document bearing my name. Only this time, the signature at the bottom was laughably close to mine, curved just enough to fool a tired clerk. Across the top, bold letters read, "Beneficiary change request." Beneath Mark's name stood alone. A second message followed. "They won't wait. Mom, please. If you don't help me, I don't know what will happen." I set the phone down with deliberate care, as though the glass might shatter under the weight of my pulse. My hands wanted to shake, but I forced them steady. This was desperation, showing its teeth no longer just whispers or polite men in suits. This was panic splattered in pixels across my screen. I forwarded the screenshot to Ruth without commentary. Within minutes, she called. Her voice carried steel, but also something softer, almost sorrow. "Eleanor, there's something you need to know. Something Harold never told you." I sat heavily at the table, the ledger open before me. "Go on." Years ago, when Mark was still in college, Harold came to me quietly. He'd discovered your son owed close to $50,000 gambling then, too. Harold liquidated some assets, paid it off, and made me draft a confidentiality agreement so you wouldn't know. He said he didn't want you to see your boy crushed. The words pressed the air from my lungs. My husband, my careful, methodical Harold, had hidden this from me. I gripped the ledger, the edges biting into my palms. So, I am not the first. I am simply the next. Ruth exhaled the sound, weary. Yes, Mark's pattern has roots deeper than you realized. Harold believed he could save him, but saving became permission. I closed my eyes. Memory rising unbidden. Harold's long absences under the guise of business, his tension before family gatherings, the way he'd sometimes defend Mark when I questioned his spending. I had mistaken it for fatherly patience. Now I saw it for what it was cover. The cycle stretched like a chain forged in secrecy. Harold had locked me out of the truth. And here I was faced with the same choice he had once made. Pay or refuse. Rescue or sever. Eleanor Ruth said gently, "This is the breaking point. If you repeat Harold's mercy, the pattern will never end. But if you hold the boundary, you may lose him." I opened my eyes and stared at the phone screen again. The forged signature glared back brazen and crude. My son's cry for help threaded with manipulation. "I already lost him," I whispered. Ruth didn't speak, letting the silence carry its own verdict. I picked up my pen and wrote the latest entry in the ledger Mark sent forged document. Harold once paid his debts in secret. The chain ends here. My hand trembled as I set the pen down, not from weakness, but from the weight of decision. For years I had believed mercy meant preservation. Now I saw that mercy without truth was rot. I deleted Mark's messages from my phone, but saved the screenshot to the secure folder Ruth had set up for me. Evidence, not pleading. Proof, not guilt. When I rose from the table, the cottage felt smaller, the walls pressing close. Yet within that closeness was clarity. I would not play Harold's part. I would not write another check sign, another line, carry another secret. The chain was broken, and the fracture would echo louder than any fire or whispered threat. The lake was still that evening, its surface a sheet of tarnished glass, reflecting the last orange wash of daylight. I walked the narrow path to Cabin 12's dock, the dossier tucked beneath my arm. My steps were steady, though inside my ribs beat like war drums. Mark was already there, leaning against the railing with a beer in hand, staring out across the water. When he heard my footsteps, he turned with a smile too thin to be convincing. "Mom, thought you'd never come back here." I stopped a few feet away, the boards creaking beneath me. I came to finish what should have been finished long ago. His brow furrowed, his smile cracking. "You sound dramatic." I placed the dossier on the railing between us and opened it. The pages fanned out like a verdict, screenshots, notarized notes, bank statements, and the still frame from my hidden camera showing Victor Doss on my doorstep. The paper smelled faintly of ink and consequence. "These," I said, "are the pieces of your truth. Fraud, debt, coercion. Everything you've done preserved and waiting for eyes that won't excuse you." He laughed too loudly. "Mom, come on. You think a pile of papers scares me? You think some notes in your neat handwriting mean anything?" I didn't flinch. "It means everything. When the bank investigator signs it, when Ruth notarizes it, when a deputy reads it. This isn't my imagination, Mark. It's your reflection." His smile dissolved, leaving only the sneer beneath. "So that's it. You're going to ruin me, your own son." "No," I said quietly. "You ruined yourself. I'm just refusing to carry the weight anymore." For a moment he stood frozen, then his face twisted with rage. He snatched a handful of papers, crumpling them in his fist, and hurled them into the water. They floated briefly before sinking ink, bleeding into ripples. "There. That's all your evidence worth." Behind the trees, a faint glint caught my eye. Caleb's phone raised just high enough to see its lens, catching every movement, every word. I had told him where I would be asked nothing more than that he stand near. "You can throw paper into the water," I said, "but the record remains. It always remains." Mark's voice cracked as his anger rose. "You think the law cares about some old woman's suspicions? You think anyone believes you over me?" "Yes," I answered, "because now they'll see you, not just hear me." He looked around sharply, sensing what I already knew. His eyes darted to the trees, searching. "Who's here?" "Someone who believes the truth deserves air." He cursed under his breath, the rage in him shifting into something more brittle fear. His grip tightened on the railing, his knuckles white. "You don't understand. I didn't have a choice. They would have—" He stopped, swallowing hard. I leaned closer, the cold lake breeze tugging at my hair. "There is always a choice. You chose silence. You chose fraud. You chose to gamble with. More than money, you gambled with me." His shoulders slumped for a heartbeat, but then his mask returned, anger hardening his face again. "If you hand that over, Mom, you end me." "No," I whispered. "I set you free from the lies. Whether you drown in them is up to you." He turned away, hurling his empty beer bottle into the lake. It shattered against a rock, the sound carrying across the still water like a warning. I gathered the remaining papers, slid them back into the folder, and tucked it beneath my arm once more. The evidence had been seen, recorded, witnessed. It no longer mattered if Mark shredded every page. The truth had already taken root beyond his reach. I walked off the dock, the boards groaning under each step. Behind me, Mark muttered curses into the twilight, his figure shrinking against the horizon of the lake. Ahead, Caleb waited at the tree-line phone, still in hand, his expression grave. And I knew the next step would no longer be mine alone. News travels differently when it comes from Nora Quince. Her voice never rises, never cracks. It simply delivers facts with the precision of a scalpel. The men your son plays with, she told me over the phone, aren't just gamblers. They're conduits. Our investigations have linked them to a ring-running identity theft through 3 states. Accounts, insurance, forged beneficiary requests, the works. Victor Doss is a collector, but also a courier. We've been building the case for months. Your dossier pushed us forward. I gripped the receiver tightly, the silence between us heavy with what she wasn't saying. This had never been only about Mark. He had stepped into a current stronger than he could swim. By the next morning, headlines confirmed it. Federal agents had raided 2 properties across the state line. Arrests were made, bank servers seized, names pulled into daylight. The ring wasn't gone, but the net was closing fast. That afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Mark's number. I nearly let it go unanswered, but something in me wanted to hear his voice. When I did, the sound of him startled me. Gone was the sharp edge of arrogance. In its place was ragged breath words that stumbled. Mom? They're taking people in. Names I know. They'll come for me next. You chose them, I said softly. I know. His voice cracked. I know. And I can't undo it. But I don't want to end the way they will. I don't want prison or worse. A pause. Then quieter. I don't want to be like Dad. The mention of Harold made my chest ache. I thought of the debts Harold had hidden, the rescues I never knew about, the chain we had both carried for Mark. What is it you want from me? I asked. Not money, he whispered. Not anymore. I need to know how to face it. What to do when they knock for me. How to walk into it without drowning. I closed my eyes, the weight of years pressing down. This wasn't the child who once ran to me with skinned knees. This was a man finally stripped of his masks, staring into a storm of his own making. And still he reached for me. I can't stop what's coming, I said slowly. But I can make sure you aren't alone when it comes. The truth is heavy, Mark. It always has been. But if you carry it yourself, at least it's honest weight. He breathed shakily as if trying to believe me. So, you'll help me. I'll stand beside the truth, I answered. That's the only help left. Neither of us spoke again for a long while. When the call ended, the silence in the cottage was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. I wrote one final note in the ledger that evening. The ring is unraveling. Mark is afraid not of debts, but of himself. He asks not for rescue, but for a way to face the tide. I set down the pen and folded my hands. Outside, the night pressed close against the windows, heavy with waiting. And I knew the end was drawing near. Ruth spread the papers across her office table, each page crisply stacked, each heading heavy with consequence. The morning light streamed through the blinds, striping the text in bars of shadow and brightness. I sat across from her, my hands folded, the old tremor gone. This is the trust arrangement, she said, sliding the first document toward me. For Mark, a conditional fund. Access only after completion of a certified rehabilitation program and demonstrable restitution. No loopholes, no shortcuts. If he refuses, the funds revert to Lyra's share. I nodded, absorbing the words like a final verdict. Ruth continued, placing another folder beside the first. For Lyra, we've earmarked steady annual support for her clinic. Not charity investment. A recognition that her work sustains more lives than one family can ever count. It secures her future without burden. Something inside me softened at that. Lyra's voice trembling with fear after the birthday tea came back to me. She had asked only for safety, never for wealth. Now safety would be written into her inheritance. Ruth picked up her pen, holding it between 2 fingers, as though measuring my resolve. This way, Eleanor, your estate doesn't vanish into fire or gambling tables. It becomes a mirror of your boundaries and your love. I thought of Harold then, his secret payments, his belief that rescue was love. I felt the weight of his silence still, but my hand did not shake when I reached for the pen. I will not buy my son's ruin any more, I said. If he wants a future, he must earn it, and if he cannot, then the fence must hold. Ruth gave a small nod, her lawyer's detachment, breaking for just a moment into something almost tender. Then let's sign. The pen glided easily, the ink dark and certain. My name flowed onto each page, no longer a weapon in someone else's hand, but a shield I forged myself. Line after line, signature after signature, until the stack grew complete. When I set the pen down, the silence between us carried a new weight finality, but also release. Ruth gathered the documents, tapping them into neat alignment. It's done. From this day forward, the rules are no longer spoken. They are binding. He cannot twist them, and Lyra cannot lose them. I exhaled slowly, a breath I hadn't known I'd been holding for years. My hands, once so used to trembling over ledgers of worry, now rested steady on the table. I've carried him too long, I murmured. Now the paper carries him, or it does not. Ruth closed her briefcase with a firm snap. You've drawn the line, Eleanor. That is no small act. The line was ink, but also blood love distilled into boundaries, mercy hardened into law. I rose, the weight in my chest, shifting into something clearer, sharper. The chain Harold had bound in secrecy was severed at last. As I stepped out of Ruth's office into the cold afternoon air, I knew the ink on those pages would not only outlast me, but outlast Mark's lies. And I knew I was ready for the reckoning that waited at dawn. The seasons turned while I waited. Winter loosened its grip on the lake, and spring came in slow breaths. Buds on the branches thawed earth beneath my boots. Mornings alive with bird call again. By summer, the grass stretched green around the cottage, and I found myself ready to open my doors. On Sundays, I made a pot of stew, the way Harold had loved it, heavy with root vegetables and herbs from the garden. Lyra came most weeks bringing fresh bread from the bakery near her clinic. Sometimes Caleb joined us carrying jars of honey his wife swore cured everything. We ate with the windows open, the breeze off the lake stirring the curtains. At the table, I always left one chair empty. It faced the water, the view long and still, as if the horizon itself were listening. No one asked about it anymore. They understood. I wrote to Mark once a month. Short letters measured words. Respect is the key, I told him. If you learn to knock, there's a door here. I never spoke of money, never promised rescue. Only the boundary clear and firm, and the faint outline of a way back if he chose it. The first reply came in late June. His handwriting was jittered, uncertain. He wrote of meetings of counselors, of the ache of admitting aloud what he had done. He didn't ask for funds. He didn't beg for freedom. He only wrote, I don't know if I can change, but I am trying. I held the letter over the stew pot that Sunday, steam rising around it, and for the first time in years, I felt no weight in my chest. The ink was his, not mine. The effort was his, not bought with my silence. Lyra arrived that afternoon with her arms full of sunflowers. She set them on the table, then noticed the letter tucked beside my place. She read my face before I spoke. Good news, better, I said. Honest news. We carried bowls of stew to the table. Caleb bowed his head for grace. His words, simple gratitude for food, for safety, for second chances. I listened, my hands wrapped around the warm mug of tea beside my plate. After we ate, Lyra poured us fresh cups and touched hers gently to mine. Her eyes glowed with quiet strength, her shoulders finally eased of the burden she'd carried for too long. To boundaries, she said. I smiled, raising my mug. To doors that stay locked until respect knocks. The empty chair faced the lake, silent as ever. Yet I no longer looked at it with grief. It was possibility, not absence. The horizon shimmered in the late sun water, rippling gold. My daughter's laughter mingled with Caleb's low hum, and the cottage felt full enough to hold both sorrow and hope. I sipped my tea, steady hands cradling the mug, knowing the story was not finished, but that I had written my chapter true, and the chair remained waiting. Outline.